In module 4, we are going to be talking about the knowledge of variation from Deming's system of profound knowledge. And this is one of the very interesting parts of Deming's system of profound knowledge. The reason for some of the things that are very interesting in the knowledge of variation is because a number of the things that Deming talks about over here goes totally against what we find happening in day-to-day life. We tend to see a lot of variation in things that are around us. However, we really do not understand how to account for this variation. We do not understand how to respond or react to this variation, and as a result, what we see is that we are really not doing what we need to do in order to bring about the kind of results that we expect from these systems. And without a proper understanding and the appropriate reactions to variations in systems, our reactions are actually counterproductive, and we sometimes make the system worse than what it was earlier. One of the things that, and a lot of you would probably relate to this particular diagram. This is your typical statistical process control chart, where we are plotting the output from a certain process over a period of time. And what we see over here is there are three lines, okay. One is the average output, and then we have two control limits, okay, an upper control limit and a lower control limit. I'm not going to talk at this point in time in terms of how these control limits are calculated, but suffice it to say that these control limits are based on the actual observed process capability and the variation in the output that is observed from the process. So it has got nothing to do with design specifications, it's got nothing to do with our expectations, but this is actual variation in the process that we observe over a period of time, which leads to the creation of the upper and the lower control limits that we see over here. The other thing that we observe is that it is important to plot these points of performance over time, because by plotting these over a period of time, we actually understand, or we come to understand, how the system is actually behaving, and that is very important. For example, if we observe, okay, a number of these points over here, we see that the variation in the process appears to be pretty much random, where the large majority of the points are falling between the upper and the lower control limits. And this is what Deming talks about as the system being in statistical control. When a system is in statistical control, the points will vary randomly above and below the average, which is the line in the middle, except for the 1 point. And the 1 point that you see is this one over here, which represents an abnormal situation or an abnormal condition, an out of control point, if you will. Until we reach this point, the system, as exhibited by all of these points, seems to be in statistical control. Okay. Now, the one thing that Deming very clearly stated, and this is extremely important, although we tend to sometimes downplay the actual difference that this particular statement makes. The fact that the system is in statistical control is not a statement of statistics. It is a statement or a judgment which is a subject matter judgment and not a judgment made by a statistician. Okay, it requires a person who understands the process, who has subject matter knowledge about that particular process, to make the statement that anything that is between the upper and the lower control limits, okay, as long as the process behaves where all the performance points lie between the upper and the lower control limits, that system is in statistical control, or it's a stable system. That is a subject matter judgment. Now, when this point is observed to be out of control, that indicates that at this particular point in time, the system has got out of control. It has got out of statistical control, and the main thing to really understand from this diagram is that the variation that we observe over here, which is the normal variation, the random variation within the upper and the lower control limits, is variation that cannot be explained, and we should not be seeking for reasons for changes between each pair of points as we see over here. Okay, the reason why we should not be seeking for variation over here is because this is the inherent variation that exists within the system or the process, and it is a variation, the amount of which is something that we cannot really control by looking at individual points. It is something that we have to take a look at the system as a whole. We'll get to that in a minute. But when things get out of control, as we see with the help of this particular point, this represents that now we have a point with an assignable cause. We ought to be trying to investigate why that point occurred. Okay, unlike all of these points whose variation we really cannot and should not try to describe, but this particular variation, which is due to the out of control point, is something that requires to be investigated, and if there is a problem, that problem needs to be taken care of so that this particular system comes back into statistical control. Deming, when he talks about lack of understanding of variation on the part of people, he says that people love to probe reasons for every single change, and we see this pretty much on a daily basis. For those of you who follow the stock market, what you'll see is that today the stock market is up by X number of points, tomorrow it is down by so many points, the third day it is off by another number of points, and you have any number of traders, journalists, and so-called experts trying to offer reasons why the stock market in general or a particular stock has gone up or down on a given day. Okay, in most of the cases, if you were to plot the behavior of the stock market and or of individual stocks over a period of time, what you will find is that a large amount of that variation is of a stable system, and there is no point in trying to describe the reason of an individual occurrence on a given day, whether up or down. Okay, and anyone who attempts to do this is really talking through his hat, because that individual does not really understand the the nature of variation, one which is inherent in the process and the one which is an outlier or an out of bound type of a situation. A lot of times what you will tend to find is that sometimes the same reason is given for the market moving up, and it is also given for the market moving down. And we as consumers, we lap up all this information because we feel that these are so-called experts who really understand, And if there were such big experts who could understand what causes or what the cause of A is, then they should be able to predict with a greater degree of certainty what is going to happen tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. Unfortunately, the track record of all of these so-called experts and pundits is extremely poor. All they are able to do is tell you in retrospect as to what happened. Okay, and that is no description of the actual reasons, because as I said, a lot of these variations are due to random fluctuations and a part of the process itself. The other thing with regard to variation is the fact that people focus on averages and below and above average performance. The sad part is that people fail to understand or somehow forget the basic statistics that when you have a system with averages, about half of the points are going to be above the average and half of the points are going to be below average. So when you talk about a below average performance, does it necessarily mean poor performance? The reason why this thing becomes very important in organizations, including in academics, is because we are so fascinated by this concept of above average, okay, that we somehow feel that if we have somebody who is above average, that person is good, and we believe that anybody who is below average is somebody who is not good. The problem is that this kind of a variation, unless this is borne out over a period of time by repetitive testing, number one, it does not reflect how a person actually is or how that person's performance really is. Secondly, a below average performance is purely just a number. It all depends on where the average is. Now, in a class or in an organization where you have high achievers, people who are extremely good will also possibly be below average. Whereas in some class or an organization of low achievers, you are going to have somebody who's going to be above average and somebody who's going to be at the top of the list. But that does not necessarily mean that that individual is very good. However, we do what we do in, and I will give you first the example of in academics, and then I'll give you an example of organizations, where we tend to use this kind of a discrimination or a segregation, I should say, not so much discrimination, of people based on whether the person is above average, how much above average, how much below average, to actually determine how good or how bad the person really is, and to use that as a basis for predicting performance. To give you an actual specific example without naming the particular school, I have been teaching in another college or an institute which offers an MBA degree. And one of the things that I found when I had completed the course and I was doing the grading, then I received a sheet from the registrar's office telling me the rules that that particular organization or institution had with regard to the distribution of grades. It told me exactly how many A's could be there, exactly, okay, X number of people or X percentage of students could be given A's. It told me precisely how many students had to be given grades of B minus and below, including an F, which told me that there was something about what had to happen irrespective of how students performed in that class. That means you had to divide the performance of the students, and this is not just this particular institute. In different forms, I find this in a number of institutions across the system. Same thing was in an organization where I was working, Being a manager, I was to provide an end of year assessment of the people who reported to me. And I was told very clearly in no uncertain terms that you got to have so many people who are considered to be above average and so many people have to be bad, literally bad. Okay, that means need improvement. Now, I think it's quite ridiculous because we think of some sort of an imaginary bell curve that this world is supposed to be operating on, and that is an assumption which has not been borne out by practice, but it is more a matter of convenience because we don't know how to deal with the problem any better. We are unable to understand this whole concept of variation, and as a result we create these differences among people when a lot of times those differences cannot and should not exist. Especially when you talk about educational institutions. There are schools in the US which will readily accept the fact that I have done this. There are classes in which 80 to 90% of the students in my class have received A's, and nobody in that organization would question why I had given so many A's. It's not that I'm a nice person and like to give A's, but I thought that the people had done an excellent job. And why should I not be able to assess the person individually? Why should I be required to put people under some sort of a bell curve? It is because we don't understand this whole concept of variation. What we tend to do as a result of this is we tend to put people in different brackets, and we try to reward people for exceptional performance in one time period, and then in the next period what we will tend to find is that the person's performance was not all that great. Now what happened? Well, typically people's performance also goes through this period of variation, and there is no reason to get overly excited if somebody's performance in one period turns out to be excellent. Okay, it's very good if it's excellent, but it does not mean that it is excellent in comparison with the others just because it was great in one time period, because the next time period, the next week, the next month, the next quarter, the next year, you will have somebody else whose performance turns out to be exceptional. You have these companies, these stores, these departments that have the employee of the week or the employee of the month, and each week or each month there's a different person whose name comes up. Why? Okay, we try to this type of so-called recognition tends to lose any meaning over a period of time, because ultimately you might as well just put up the names and pictures of different people by rotation in any random order. It would do just as good. Most of this is really not taking into account the actual efforts of people, and it is not really providing any kind of real motivation. We'll talk about motivation a little bit later. Now Deming had a very famous set of experiments. One is called the red bead experiment, and the other one is called the funnel experiment. And both of these experiments basically were devised or designed to depict this variation and what happens when we attempt to do something when no action is required. That means when there is some sort of random variation in the process and we try to improve the process by making a change, we actually make things worse. And I don't have the red bead experiment that we conducted, but I do have the funnel experiment that we have a video of, and the link to the video is given to you on this particular sheet. It's right here. And what this funnel experiment, to give you a very brief idea, is the funnel experiment has a funnel which is positioned above a sheet of paper on which there is a crosshair drawn, and the intersection point of that particular crosshair is where you are supposed to drop a marble through the funnel, and the marble should come to a halt on that intersection point. That is your target. And there are different ways in which you react to when the marble is dropped and it is not on that particular target. In one case, you leave the system alone. In other cases, you make adjustments to the system in order to try and improve the accuracy of that particular marble. And what you find is that whenever you're trying to make adjustments, because that movement of the marble is really random, you actually increase the variance. And what I would suggest is that please take a look at that particular video, and I think you will gain a better understanding. What Deming also talked about in terms of the variation, again he described two types of variations and the causes for them. One is what he talked about as the common causes, which is the inherent variation that I have talked about earlier, and the other one is special causes, which are those outliers, those out of control points. And anytime you have a variation in the system, what Deming said is that 85% of the variation and the problems that are caused by the variation are caused by the system, which can only be affected by the management. And only 15% of the variation and the problems that are caused on the shop floor or in the system are due to something that workers actually do. So if you really want to have a significant improvement in the performance of the system, it is management's responsibility to take proactive action to prevent problems from occurring again. Common causes cannot be explained, they cannot be justified, and if we try to take any action to correct for these common causes, it ends up increasing the variation, as you will see in the funnel experiment when you see the video. The only way in which we can bring about really change in the system which are due to common causes is for management to understand the system and what is it that causes the system to perform at a certain level. It is not an individual point, but it's the overall behavior of the system which needs to be attended to, and by addressing the needs of that system and by bringing about improvements in the system, and examples would be the quality of the incoming material. Okay, now that is something which, when it causes variations in the output from a certain process, it is something that a worker has no control over. Or when machines break down and the output obviously suffers as a result of that, it is something which is again beyond what a worker can control, and these are things that the management has to take care of by changing the way in which material is purchased. So changing the criteria, which is price based, to having more total cost viewpoint, taking quality, delivery, etc. into account, or in the case of a machine breakdown, bringing the preventative maintenance into consideration, and that is again something that the management can do something about. It's when you have these special causes, which is when a point goes out of control, that is where we need to try and understand what specifically went wrong, and you can investigate the specific causes of that particular point and then take corrective action to ensure that that particular incident does not reoccur. Okay. The performance of a system under statistical control can be predicted. That means what we say is that if the conditions remain as they are, that means whatever are the current conditions, if they remain as they are, the system remains in control, and the performance of the system will vary between the control limits. That is the prediction that we are making. And this judgment, okay, this is a judgment that we are making, is subject to being wrong. That means it's the theory that we talked about earlier when we were talking about the earlier modules, when we are talking about some of the attributes of a theory, that a theory has to be something that runs the risk of being proven wrong, and when it is proven wrong, then you go back and you reevaluate your theory so that you gain more knowledge. And the second thing is that this judgment is not a statistical judgment, as I had mentioned earlier, but it is a subject matter judgment. That means it requires the input from a person who actually understands the process to say, yes, as long as these conditions remain within control, the output from the system will also remain between the control limits. So this is not a statistical judgment or a statistical statement, but it is a subject matter judgment or a subject matter statement. The system under statistical control can only be changed by studying the system as a whole. Again, I have mentioned this earlier, and this would be done by investigating why or how the system behaves in a certain manner, and only management has the authority to bring about these changes, to bring about overall systemic policies and quality of incoming product, and or the initiation of preventative and total productive maintenance are examples of policies which are in the management's purview, which will bring about improvement in the system performance. Admonishing and exhorting workers to work harder is not going to result in any improvement in the system or solving any of the problems that exist. We will come back and continue with the psychology of individuals, systems, and changes.